So a man named Christopher Columbus accidentally discovers America on his way to the other side of the world. And he was like,
As long as I'm here, I guess I'll steal some stuff.
and so he did. He returned to Europe with 4 wheelbarrows full of gold, and all of a sudden everyone wanted to explore America. Britain and France both claimed that America was theirs, and they went to war over it. The British troops were led by George Washington, and with the help of the Native Americans, the French finally surrendered. So the British won America. But their victory cost a whole lot of money, and now they were broke, so they asked America if they could borrow some. But guess what America said? So Britain just taxed them. They introduced this thing called the Stamp Act, where whatever you buy the shop owner puts a stamp on it, meaning you have to pay extra. At first, the colonies thought they could do what they wanted, but the British seemed to be micromanaging and taking control over them. So guess what? They rioted, and they ditched all British goods. And the British decided to fight fire with fire, so the more people protested, the more they taxed them. So there was basically a tax for every resource you could possibly need. Sounds a lot like modern-day California. And guess what? The people protested again, British goods were boycotted again, and the British still weren't making any money. So King George, this smug asshole, repealed all the taxes but kept the T1 and sent troops to America to force the colonists to pay for them. As you can guess, they didn't take this well, so they started throwing rocks and harassing the British troops. But the British didn't like that, so guess what they did? So the British reloaded, aimed their guns, and fucking opened fire! They killed 5 people, and that just pissed the colonies off even more. So on December 16, 1773, a group of patriots disguised as Native Americans went on board a British ship and threw a bunch of tea into the sea. And the British were pissed, so they sent a bunch more troops to occupy the colonies. And the colonies were more mad than ever, so they sent representatives from each state to meet at Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, including
Thomas Jefferson?
Here.
Benjamin Franklin?
Here.
John Footpenis?
It's Hancock now.
Why?
Mind your business, that's why.
So they set up defenses all around Boston, and people like Paul Revere warned that the British were coming. The British pushed them all the way to Concord, but soon they were outnumbered and were forced to retreat back to Boston. Meanwhile, a dude called Benedict Arnold decided to go invade a fortress called Ticonderoga, and with the help of Ethan, they managed to capture the fort without an effort. Meanwhile, George Washing Machine gets elected commander-in-chief, and boy was he sexy, says himself. Meanwhile, the colonists sent a letter to King George saying that if they remove all the unfair taxes, they could be friends. But King George wrote back, no thanks. By the way, your wife tastes like fish. He tasted my wife? Anyways, after they kicked the British out of Ticonderoga, they stole all the heavy artillery lying there. So now George Washing Machine and his men had themselves some bazookas. Meanwhile, Washington set up defenses all around Boston surrounding the trapped British. So they had no choice but to retreat from Boston all the way to Canada. And Washington won for the first time. Then he moved to New York because knowing the British, they would probably land there next. Meanwhile, a lot of people back then were doing stupid stuff like peeing in the sink, so a man named Thomas Paine wrote a book telling them not to pee in the sink, so they stopped. Meanwhile, the other Thomas was elected to write the Declaration of Independence. Basically a long list that said everyone should be treated equal, well, except black people. And so the 13 colonies became the United States, securing their independence. And King George was pissed, so he sent more British troops to go get America. And guess what? Washing Machine's prediction was right. The British had decided to land in New York. Now, Washington was prepared ahead of time, but facing the most powerful navy was going to be difficult for anyone. Anyways, Washington set up his defenses all over New York, waiting for an attack to come in, and needless to say, he got what he asked for. The British troops pinned the Americans in a corner, but for some reason didn't attack, allowing the Americans to escape across the East River. The Americans just kept getting their ass whooped over and over again. They were pushed all the way to Pennsylvania, where some patriots got sick and died or just quit in general. Meanwhile, the British settled in New Jersey and just chilled for the winter, but little did they know that Washington was about to strike, just not right now. King George also hired a bunch of Hessians from Germany, who are basically the bloodthirsty barbarians of Europe. So the Hessians set up defenses near the Patriots camp, but decided to take 5 for a cuddling party. But once the Patriots realized the Hessian guards were making love, they decided to give them a taste of their own medicine. He crossed the Delaware River to the Hessians' camp and completely slaughtered them. After they took care of the Hessians, they charged at the British, and after the British got beat 3 times, they left Princeton and South New Jersey for good. They also got beat elsewhere, and the British government were really pissed that they haven't won yet. So they came up with this plan that General Burgoyne in Canada and General William Howe in New York would invade and split the United States in the middle, blocking all transmission lines. So Burgoyne got all the way to Walloomsac, New York, but the Americans defended it quite fiercely in the Battle of Bennington. Burgoyne hoped William Howe would show up with reinforcements, but instead William Howe was like, "Nah, fuck this," and decided to take over the capital, Philadelphia. And he actually won it. After that, William Howe and Burgoyne both returned to the UK. Meanwhile, Washington's army were newly trained by a German general, and all of a sudden they were ready for war again. They wanted to take Philadelphia back, but it turned out the British abandoned Philadelphia and headed for New York instead. They tried to attack the British from New Jersey, but no one technically won. The Americans expected more help from France, but it turns out the French weren't their only supporters. Spain and even some Native Americans joined the war, helping America beat the Brits. But some Native Americans joined the British as well, so for them it was more of a civil war than a revolution. A lot of slaves were also temporarily freed to fight in the war. Now I say temporarily because douchebags like Washington promised them freedom if they helped them fight UK. But guess what? They didn't, and after the war they went back to their life as private butlers. Plus, many of them never saw their family again, and that's just low. Oh, and remember Benedict Arnold? He betrayed the Americans and joined the British. Shame on you, Benedict Arnold. If you stayed here, you could have gotten bitches. Now you're just gonna go down as the biggest traitor in history. Really? Meanwhile, the British could tell war in the North wasn't going well, so they decided to take over the South instead. And that was actually pretty easy, with thousands of Americans surrendering to them. So George Washington sent a dude called Nate Greene to deal with Cornwallis, the British general. He wanted to sneak up and get Cornwallis from behind, a strategy the British used on them many times before, but I guess Cornwallis was familiar with his own tactics because he didn't fall for it. Cornwallis chased Greene's troops all the way to a river in Virginia, and by that time, Cornwallis's men were as tired as hell. All the meanwhile, Greene was gathering reinforcements, and while the British were catching their breath, they would launch an attack. But in the end, it was kind of a tie. Cornwallis decided he needed to take Virginia if he wanted control of the colonies, so he advanced into Yorktown. Meanwhile, up in the north, Washington was planning the Battle of Yorktown. They tricked the British in making it seem like they'd attack somewhere else, but then the troops sailed all the way to Virginia and landed in the Chesapeake Bay, sinking a few British ships guarding it. More American troops came from land, and they completely surrounded the British. Cornwallis yelled out for reinforcements, but no one came. And in the end, Cornwallis was forced to surrender within a month. After a gruesome defeat, with 8,000 Redcoats taken prisoner, the British government finally said, "Fuck it." And after signing the Peace Treaty of Paris, the British troops were drafted out of America. The British gave them the rest of the land owned by them, and in return, the Americans finally gave them the money they owed. Washington wanted to go back to his house and get a nice massage, but he didn't have time for that because all of a sudden he was the first president of America. He and the other founding fathers inspired the American people to build a great country. As for the British, well, let's just say that if them and America have another war, they won't win. And so won't anyone else. And eventually America got so bored they attacked themselves. And that's it.